The Vreth had been building warships for 400 years. They had never considered that armor in sufficient thickness might be an argument that invited a more patient kind of reply. Piera noticed the smell first, something between machine oil and the sea, though the Ur-Athsolen had never touched water. The flagship's interior was damp in a way that had nothing to do with moisture. It was the damp of enclosed stone, of old cathedrals, of places where the weight of accumulated meaning pressed down on the air itself. Admiral Threshameth moved through the corridor ahead of her with the unhurried confidence of a creature who had never been rushed by anything. He was large in the way that senior Vreth were large, not tall but broad. His lateral mantle spread slightly in what Piera had learned was a posture of ownership. "This is my ship. These are my walls. Feel how they do not move." "The outer plating," he said, stopping at a viewport cut into the hull itself. Through 2 layers of transparency, Piera could see the edge of the armor, 40 centimeters of layered composite, each stratum a different alloy, the whole assembly built to distribute kinetic impact the way a root system distributes the weight of a tree. 40 years of metallurgical research, the finest material science the Vreth hegemony has produced in 3 generations. Piera stepped to the viewport. The plating caught the light of the system's star and held it dull and absolute. "It's extraordinary," she said, because it was. "Nothing made by minds has ever passed through this." Threshameth placed his palm flat against the inner wall beside the viewport. The gesture was automatic, habitual, the way a person touches a doorframe when they pass through a familiar house. "That is not a boast, it is a fact of the galaxy as it currently exists." Piera said nothing. She looked at the armor and ran her thumb along the joint between the viewport housing and the hull, feeling the tolerances. They were good. They were very good. She put her hands in her pockets. "You have reviewed our engagement records," Threshameth said. It was not a question. "I have. And your armor performs exactly as designed." He studied her. Vreth eyes were set wide, their focus binocular in a way that made them appear to be examining 2 different things simultaneously. Perhaps they were. "You say this as though it is a narrow compliment." "I say it as though it's true," Piera said. "May I see the council chamber?" She was given a seat below the gravity deck's median line. This was, she had been briefed, the Vreth way of indicating observer status. You sat low enough that the working officers occupied your upper field of vision, a physical enactment of hierarchy. She did not mind. From below you could see the underside of things. The council met for 3 hours. They discussed the Skell incursions, 7 raids in 4 months targeting convoy routes between the hegemony's outer settlements. The Skell ships were fast and lightly armed. They hit and withdrew before the Vreth's slower, heavier vessels could bring their weapons to bear. 3 convoys had been destroyed. The losses were, the council agreed, acceptable. Piera wrote in her notes, "acceptable." She underlined it once, then she closed the notebook and listened to the rest of the meeting. That night, alone in the quarters she'd been assigned, small, humid, the walls curved in a way that suggested the room had been designed for a differently shaped body. She opened her terminal and began pulling Vreth metallurgical data from the advisory files she'd been granted. She cross-referenced it with the weapons specifications she'd brought from Earth. She was not building anything yet. She was only looking at what the numbers said when you put them beside each other. The numbers said something interesting. She made a cup of tea from her own supplies, the Vreth ate, but at intervals and in combinations that turned her stomach, and sat with the terminal on her knees and the tea going cold in her hand, reading. Outside the viewport, the stars moved slowly as the Ur-Athsolen completed its patrol arc. The armor was out there in the dark, 40 centimeters thick, holding everything together. Piera drank the cold tea and kept reading. The Skell came at the 14th hour of the 2nd day, while Piera was in the observation gallery eating a nutrition block and watching a Vreth maintenance crew retorque a secondary gun mount. She heard the alert before the words resolved, a low, resonant tone that the Vreth used for battle stations, less urgent sounding than human equivalents, more like a bell struck once in a large room. Through the gallery's broad viewport she watched the Skell ships emerge from their transit scatter, 8 vessels smaller than anything the Vreth fielded, hull surfaces matte and radar absorbent. They moved in a pattern she recognized from the engagement records. Fan out, identify targets, strike the soft points. The battle took 40 minutes, she watched all of it. The Vreth were magnificent in a terrible way. The Ur-Athsolen and its 2 heavy escorts absorbed fire that would have vaporized a human destroyer and continued to advance, guns cycling, armor-eating impact after impact with nothing but surface scoring to show for it. The Skell weapons were not adequate to the task they'd been assigned. They knew it. They shifted targets away from the flagship toward the lighter escorts. One escort died in the 6th minute. Engine node strike precisely placed, the kind of shot that required either extraordinary intelligence or advanced knowledge of Vreth ship architecture. The vessel didn't explode, it simply stopped, drive gone, power cascading backward through systems that weren't designed to absorb that kind of reversal. It drifted. The Skell left it and moved on. The second escort died in the 22nd minute, same location, same method. The Vreth won the engagement. The Skell withdrew with 3 of their own ships damaged, unwilling to continue against the flagship's armament once they'd accomplished whatever they'd come to accomplish. Threshomath declared it a successful defense. At the debrief, Piera raised her hand the way she'd seen junior Vreth officers do, a lateral spread of the fingers, a request to speak without presumption. "The engine nodes," she said when Threshomath acknowledged her. "Both escorts were killed through strikes to the node housing. The Skell targeted the same location twice, which suggests they knew where to look." "The escorts are a known design," Threshomath said. "Their vulnerabilities are not secret." "Then the solution is to protect the nodes." "The solution is heavier escorts," he moved on, "inventory reports. Or a deterrent that makes the Skell unwilling to close to node strike range," Piera said. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms become quiet when someone has said something that falls outside the available categories. Several officers looked at the floor. One studied his hands. "We did not ask for your weapons," Threshomath said. His voice was even. "We asked for your presence, your observation, your analysis of tactics we might adapt to our own doctrine." He looked at her directly, both eyes focusing together, the Vreth gesture of undivided attention which could mean respect or could mean warning. "We did not ask for human technology." "I understand," Piera said. "Good." She did understand. She understood that asking again through the correct channels would take weeks she didn't have, and that the Skell would return before any approval came through, and that the next time they came they might bring weapons adequate to what they were apparently trying to accomplish. That night she pulled the Vreth metallurgical data again. She did not run her simulation with the advisory terminal that would log to Threshomath's records. She ran it on her personal unit, a battered thing she'd carried for 6 years, using the specifications she knew from memory. The simulation was not complex. Kinetic energy is kinetic energy. Mass times velocity squared delivered at the correct angle into the correct material told you exactly what would happen. She ran it 3 times to be certain. The result was the same each time: 40 centimeters of Vreth composite, the finest material science the hegemony had produced in 3 generations, breached in 0.3 seconds by a sustained hypervelocity rod at standard human railgun output. She sat with that number for a long time. From the corridor outside her quarters, she heard the Vreth Night Watch complete its pass, 4 crew members, their footfalls heavier than human, their murmured exchange in a register below her full comprehension. Later, one of them would tell a shipmate that the human advisor had made a sound when they passed her door. Not distress, not the sound of someone in pain. The sound, the Night Watch crew member said, of a creature that had found the thing it had been looking for. Piera wouldn't have described it that way. She would have said she simply exhaled. She closed the terminal. She looked at the components she'd brought in her advisory kit, standard diplomatic attaché equipment, human spec, nothing that would have triggered Vreth customs inspection because none of it was, strictly speaking, a weapon. Not assembled. She began making a list. The Skell came back on the 5th day with twice the ships and a different strategy. Piera heard the battle alert and was already moving before it resolved into language. She had spent 2 days in the Urath Solen's lower engineering bays on what she had described, to the single Vreth technician who asked, as a review of human Vreth power system compatibility. The technician had not asked again. The Vreth did not, as a cultural matter, question advisory staff twice. She reached the junction she'd identified on the ship's schematics and began working. Above her, she could feel it through the hull, through the deck plating, through the soles of her boots. The battle was going wrong. The Skell had learned. 16 ships this time, and they were not attacking the escorts, they were attacking the flagship. Not trying to breach it, they knew better, they were trying to stop it. She heard the engine note change beneath her, the drives cycling as the helmsman pushed for maneuver speed, then a hard shudder that meant something had hit the drive housing. Not through the armor, around it. The same node strike logic applied to a larger target, and the Skell had apparently done their geometry. The ship went quiet in a way that was not silence but was the absence of the thing that had been making noise. The drives were gone. Piera kept working, her hands were steady. She had noticed over the years that her hands were always steadiest when there was no longer any question about whether to proceed. The assembly was crude by any standard she'd been trained to. A railgun emitter was not a complicated instrument. The principle was older than space travel, a conducting rail and a magnetic field and a projectile and enough current to make the math work. What she'd built was the minimum viable version of that principle, fed from the Urasolen's own auxiliary power core through a splice she was not certain would survive more than 3 sustained bursts. She did not need more than 3. She opened a channel to the bridge. "Admiral, I need 30 seconds of fire suppression on bearing 27 Mark IV, the Skell lead vessel." Threshomath's voice came back immediately. "Lieutenant Piera, you are in a restricted area of. I know 30 seconds, after that you can have me arrested." A pause. Outside the hull she could not hear but feel through the metal through the structure of the ship itself, the sound of weapons impacting armor. The Skell were not trying to breach it. They were trying to keep the Vreth gunners busy while something else was positioned. "Granted," Threshomath said. She fired. The recoil was worse than she'd anticipated. The mount was improvised, the bracing insufficient, and the first burst cracked 2 of the supports she'd welded 40 minutes ago. She corrected, fired again. The third burst she held for a full second, feeding power from the auxiliary core until the splice screamed and tripped its own breaker. Through a secondary camera she'd patched to her terminal, another thing she had done during her review of human Vreth power system compatibility. She watched the railgun rods strike the Skell lead vessel's mass driver housing. Not its hull, its weapon. The housing was not armored the way the hull was. Nothing was armored the way the hull was. The impacts walked across the weapon assembly and took it apart piece by piece with a patience that was not patience but simply physics, doing what physics does when you give it enough velocity. The Skell lead vessel stopped firing. The Skell fleet hesitated. It was not a long hesitation. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. But a hesitation is a decision being made, and decisions being made meant something had changed in their calculation. They had encountered a weapon they had not prepared for, fired from a ship they believed was dead in space, and whatever their commanders had planned for this engagement had not included this variable. Threshomath read the hesitation correctly. His voice on the fleet channel was calm, the bell strike of Vreth command. His remaining ships shifted to cover the angles Piera's position had exposed, and the Skell, their lead vessel silent and their formation broken, withdrew. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the dead drives. This silence had weight. Piera sat on the deck next to the ruined emitter mount and looked at what she'd built. It was genuinely ugly, a salvaged power tap, 2 conducting rails from equipment that had not been designed to conduct in this direction, a magnetic coil wound by hand, the whole assembly held together by weld seams that would not have passed any inspection she'd ever sat through. It had fired 3 times. It had done what she needed. She heard footsteps. She did not look up until they stopped. Threshomath stood at the junction entrance. He was looking at the assembly the way a person looks at something they do not yet have a category for. After a moment he crossed the distance between them and stood beside the emitter. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached out and placed his palm flat against the barrel. The metal was still hot. He did not move his hand. Piera watched him. She thought she understood what he was doing, the same gesture he'd made in the corridor, touching the hull that nothing had ever passed through. He was measuring something, not the weapon. The weapon was simple. Physics, assembled by hand, fired 3 times. He was measuring the distance between what the Vreth had believed about the galaxy, that armor was the end of the question, that sufficient thickness made the question meaningless, and what the galaxy had just demonstrated it actually was, a place where questions did not end, where every sufficient answer contained within it the shape of the next question, where 40 years of metallurgical research and 40 centimeters of composite hull were extraordinary and real, and not enough. He was measuring the distance between those 2 things and finding it was not a distance at all. It was a door. He had not walked through it yet. Piera could see that. He was still standing in the corridor, palm against the warm metal, both eyes focused on something she could not see. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Some distances a person has to measure alone at their own pace in their own silence. Outside the hull, the stars continued in their indifferent arcs. The Skell ships were gone. The drives would take 6 hours to restore. The armor was intact, 40 centimeters of composite, unmarked, having done exactly what it was designed to do. Threshomath finally lowered his hand, he looked at Piera, then he looked back at the emitter. "Show me," he said, "how it works."